I thought I'd get started on this rainy, dreary Tuesday of October 14th, 2020 in Tacoma with testimony about what was going on at the time that the Carnegie Mellon University Drama Department, working with a Fox media agent who was living in my mother's house, staged the phony discovery of a script that they themselves had written. And the drama department at the time included Megna Wen. And a great deal of the activity surrounded a location that was at 3549 Beechwood Boulevard in the city of Pittsburgh. My next door neighbor was a Mack truck dealer who took me to the Good Ship Lollipop for a Notch Babies gathering that was addressed by Arlen Specter. Arlen Specter is known to some of the few observers of my testimony to have been the author of the single bullet theory. Oliver Stone depicted Jim Garrison as calling him a liar in the movie JFK. Notch babies are a cause that he has adopted, or he had adopted at the time. They were people who were born on leap year, and by the misfortune of legal services were excluded from a certain Social Security benefit or something of that sort. And they would gather every so often on the Good Ship Lollipop. Some of the other people who lived in the house, Megna Wen, as I may have said, used to visit. She's a screen actress who did the voice of Mullen. She was introduced to me by Michael Mullen of Carnegie Mellon University. And a woman named Lene lived there. She worked for John Schulman, the museum thief who was recently arrested. And another friend of John Schulman, Justin Vicari, lived there. And he used to call my world a prison because I wasn't gay. Tom O'Connor came over to, I think he was trying to hit on a girl named Debbie from the Latin Studies program at Pitt who lived there for a while, and PT, Parvana Turkamani, and her boyfriend used to live there. So there was a turnover of people. It was sort of a rooming house for collegiate types. And Tom O'Connor, who owned the van that drove recklessly at Kelly's school, was in the hallway with the drawers open, lying on his back, talking on his phone, and acting like a detective. And he had me run some errands over in Point Breeze to an architecture firm who had me print some plans for them. This was Drama Club Greek, you would call it. So what was going on at 3549 was across the street from the Artec architect from WQED. He built Tom Ammon's house, and he also built the Salk Research Labs with Louis Kahn, and was part of the fabled Skybus routine that never materialized in the city of Pittsburgh. And he's the one who locked me in a house from the inside when the man who tortured me and gassed me as a child came in. I was locked in the house from the inside with this person. And one of the things we know from the Rusted Root gang who was around, Deborah really liked the Swamp Band. They were pretty good. Was that you weren't allowed to tell the truth about how I was driven from East Liberty, how I was tortured there. People said it never took place. So we have a picture of a person who was a child who was terribly traumatized, battered, horribly mauled, confused, in a state of incomprehension that surfaced years later, and they apparently are willing to stand on formality and insult every man, woman, and child in the human race, along with their honcho Robert Fripp, whose friends Peter Gabriel and so on were writing to me at the time at 35, 49, and I was divulging some of the strange details to them, thinking that they were okay. I mean, I was being depicted maliciously in a whisper campaign. Something you need to understand about drama club types is when they used depiction, they had this thing called Radio KKK at CMU, and they depicted Klansmen. They will say, oh, we were just depicting them. They depict foul play and spaghetti westerns, people getting dumbed down. And so when it came to lying about my reality, depiction was nothing to them. And yet they went cherry picking for comments and statements to yank out of context and use for their drama club scene without looking into any of the real activities that were happening, without looking accurately at what was going on. And I was trying to show that some of the details were peculiar, that there was a suspicious network of human trafficking that was have picked on me as what they were calling a cherry boy, because when they attacked me, I had never been used for sex by this East End pedophile syndicate. And so they were betting on me and taking me into custody and hostage. And then Rusted Root was covering for them, and Carnegie Mellon University united to cover for them and started selling the movies, swapping the movies, adding to the movies by an actual rape of my Korean um, friend who taught me sign language and made black market films that they could sell, while depicting me as somehow having some kind of, you know, character flaw. So my deafness is a character flaw and so on. And so they excluded me. And what you see if you go across town at this time is that the drama club had set up residence for Raymond Geiger and Joel Kaplan at this horseshoe turn in the road by a house that looks like the White House. And the Mancine group and Austro Donald, the pedos, had intoxicated me and morally abducted me in a VW owned by one of their friends, and they made this horseshoe turn and the car's axle wiggled and the car was abandoned, and I did what they did, which was run home. And years later, a friend of Pio Leo returned me that place to push a VW with him about a mile. And this is a creepy illustration of their settlements program. But this was also right by where Tim McGuire, which is like the Molly Maguires, who ended up at NASA when they blew up the Challenger, lived. So Joel was working with Tat, and I suspect McManus and Trump, on creating an au pair of me and him. The idea of an invisible guest is mandatory in the doctrines of the school of thought that was already in place in the United States of America. Much like Islam, fanatical loyalty to the United States of America often comes from people who don't know a whole lot about it. They're just cherry picked. They like this, they like that. And Donald Trump's dungeon of thinking is a hard sell that these actors, like out of villains from a Marvel comic book, who want everybody to know what they did. Mark Nordenberg is like that. These actors, he was the chancellor of the University of Pittsburgh. These actors want to sell that they conquered Franklin Roosevelt and Kennedy's America fair and square. That shooting Kennedy in the head, and then Cyril Wecht steals his brain, apparently, from Smithsonian. Anyway, Ian Watmaker, who poisoned me with a nerve agent, used to go around saying, idea has struck the mind, right? So the idea was they strike out the mind and replant. He took me to the incredible two-headed transplant and Lee Marvin's Something Big. So the idea was that they were transplanting the mind of America and winning fair and square because Herbert Hoover's pro-German, Quaker-rooted uh, fascism had been in place a long time. I want to talk a little bit about the invisible guest that from the Bohemian Grove circle, because that's what Peter Gabriel and Trump pulled when they au paired me with Reagan, who blew up the Challenger as a symbol of the invisible guest. And what you have is a situation where the invisible guest was also called that voice again on the album So, and it wasn't just the Challenger. Adam Eisenstadt, whose friends and neighbors worked with John Schulman, disguised his voice as Abdul the terrorist on KDK radio. They apparently knew what he was doing and made himself out to look like a Palestinian terrorist on the eve of the Locker G bombing. And this was when Davy Jones Locker was around with his friend Jocelyn and stuff. So, who was leaving me, looking like a haggard man who couldn't get along with anybody. Nobody wants to be involved with someone like that. And there was also a post in the Pitt News, the letter of Rajpal Crowe, and Admiral Crowe shot down the Iranian jetliner. So the Challenger, the Lockheed G, and the Iranian jet were all signifiers of the invisible guest. And what they expected was to have people, just scattering, saying, oh, don't make it into a whole big thing, was one of the comments I heard. So, when you look at the standstill agreement, where Hoover moved to try to sort of pacify things, he was actively promoting Nazi Germany. His Quaker roots, very similarly, the Friends Meeting House is neighbors to a place that's tiled with the swastika, and they were covering for the AIDS experiment. This is leading to the call I got to Mount Desert Island after the murder of Linda Rosen. The call from Will Zell, who had, as I've testified, had prior knowledge of AIDS, was talking about it before it happened, and was in school with Daya, who called me when John Lennon staged his Disappearing Act. So, but the idea that people cherry pick to justify their thinking is part of something that Hollywood exploits, and they add things the way that they did. I talked about it in The Second Death of Huey Long, when Robert Penn Warren wrote a fiction about him, just a fiction. But he supposedly made a movie, Fair and Square, about him, and they're making a new America fair and square by striking out the, very important intellectual JFK was. I mean, Chomsky's character assassinations never address what he really said in his book Strategy for Peace. He was a very important intellectual with a very important intellectual tradition behind him. A friend of Eleanor Roosevelt, Martha Gellhorn, wrote me when I was living in Montana after I left Mount Desert Island. And although that skips ahead with this story a little bit, it is relevant because she was apparently tearing her hair with denial about what London was doing. So, what you see at the beginning of this, however, with the murder of Linda Rosen and the pendulum back and forth, is you have Umberto Eco's Foucault's pendulum starting to develop, which was the invisible guest had a neuroplasm that was hypnotized to express Hollywood limits of Pittsburgh style of speech and then be challenged by the psychiatric pornography production company to prove by performances that it was not dangerous. And Foucault's pendulum also functioned as Yojimbo because people are not necessarily inciting racial feuds, but often they sympathize with one side or the other. So you have the Taliban mind reader, Yusuf Endor and Peter Gabriel, come in, and now it's not just depictions of violence anymore, it's dreams made real. You see, that's what 911 was for them. And Daya, who called me, whose namesake called me when I was living with Obama's Afghan Army director, or namesake of Army director for Afghanistan at Temple on December 8th, 1980. She used to say, people never do anything about the sort of troubles there are in the world. And she would mock me the way Gail Burston used to. Oh, you're going to be so famous someday. And I met her at the governor's school with people who were very blonde, Aryan, and liked to show off monkeys, right? So the Daya, who's outside the 911 World Trade Center, with her stiletto, famous picture of Daya Golis, who led the movement that Seattle, Washington put together, the attack on my mouth. When I had a cream and somebody gave me a shot on one of my fingers when I started getting some speckles, the doctor was actually angry that I had something that worked at home. Because the reason is because they started, using this idea of a Swami Nosha that developed from Penis Gabriel and Yusuf Endor, his ISIS magnate from Africa, to satisfy these dreams made real in the body politic. So Foucault's pendulum going back and forth was like Yojimbo. We hit that side, then we hit this side. And we hit this symbol and logo rapon, and they call it therapy. So they hit symbols, la-di-da. And you see this in the burning of the Jackson Labs, the bombing on the USSR, 911. It's like we're calling it Operation Medicine Man. And no doubt there's some very creepy Indians in Seattle, Sherman Alexie talking to, North Korea's Kim. You have a book like this book, and I call your attention to it for a minute because Cha Tang simplifies now into being like Chang, and Justin Chang was widely admired as, his namesake Justin Vicari was in place at 3549 as a string puller of the incidents that Meg Nguyen was involved in, and the situation has long armed to Seattle. So, you have this situation where they set up a staged and phony discovery of this script, and then instead of warning people and trying to apprehend the people who were behind AIDS, they make all of these excuses and pornographic films and say there's going to be a book. And I want to mention the arrest of the book dealer for museum theft because the situation shows you what a catastrophic moron Barack Obama is, as does the murder of Circe Kennedy in Massachusetts, which was on his watch socially. These were the Israeli Gestapo who were acting out their frenzied justification for what Penis Gabriel and John Schulman were doing with this Warhol book. Well, the thing about it is that in America, legally, you can't force somebody to take less money than something is worth. I read about that when I was reading about how this gang had, you know, after my father died, had graffitied his obituary with German Green Party, ejected people, don't know who, and other relevant things. And then given his cashmere coat to their dog and made off with my Roland guitar synthesizer and gotten a call from Fripp congratulating them. And so, you know, how can they pay me $300 for $2,000 guitar and false pretenses, a $1,200 guitar, false pretenses? And after opening, before giving it to me and almost refusing to give it to me, that was the Hollywood Music Store. Hollywood, you know, I don't know who she slept with. So you have this situation where it was insured by Liberty Mutual's Rick Lux, like Clucks. So you have this situation. They were neighbors of the girl who introduced me to the girl who penned the script. You know, Alice Shertalk was living over there and so forth. But the point is, you can't legally sell somebody's shirt that way. And the bookstores in Pittsburgh would give me $2 for what I knew was a $40 book, now out of print and irreplaceable. And I would let them do it because brought back memories of a bookstore in Seattle where she always gave me a fair price. Mega's bookstore always gave me a fair price. You can't legally. It's like a joke from the British Ivy League on Obama on the idea of reparations. You know, Reagan, I'll just scrawl in Jimmy Crary's name right here, and you can take all you want from him, you know. And that's what they did. They stole everything. They used me for pornography. I mean, they're criminally insane. So, and Obama incites them and says, oh, because of Leslie Katz. Leslie Katz introduced me to a girl who called herself a lesbian for magical religion, Tammy Simon. And the whole dialectic with Tammy was it was a lesbian relationship that I had with Leslie. And she takes me to Princeton. And there's this incredible electricity in the woods, and she looks like John Lennon. She has this aquiline nose that often, and she looked a lot like him. And she ends up with the Dalai Lama. Angela, who ran National Health and Nutrition in Pittsburgh at the corner where Mr. Rogers had his church, where this guy was introduced to me, shows up at Seattle Dalai Lama working there. Patsy Williamson runs the CCAC Honors Department where WQED polled its most horrifying home invasion and pornographic show before chemically castrating me. It regularly meets with the Dalai Lama in India. So you have, and Christine Gregoire, who covered for the unidentified registered nurse who slipped me the poison that led to diabetes and heart malfunction and reduced erectile function, was a partner of the Dalai Lama when he appeared in Seattle. So you have this Mysterian group and world-class violinist Midori Goto, who puts out a telltale clip in a film with this crowd who work with Bobby Yendel, who the Asian Cult Cinema Group and Northwest Asian Weekly in Seattle consider an Asian symbol of political prosperity. Well, he's the one who was so beloved to the people who loved David Duke in Louisiana. And he put up a fuss about don't tear down the Confederate statues, and yet they say he's the honorary, the black man, because Will Zell's AIDS war game conferred Midori Goto to the Black Master of Ceremonies at WQED. It gets pretty creepy. And they're shooting down planes and stuff. So you have this situation with Arlen Specter, Cyril Wecht, and Umberto Eco playing Foucault, who, by the way, went to the Middle East to negotiate with the Ayatollah Khomeini while he was setting up suicide bomber stage in Paris and New York, one of whom, Sean Straub, was outside the Dakota December 8, 1980, none of which gets investigated. The fact that Dolly Myron was named with Sean Straub in books never gets investigated, and she was center of a crowd in Pittsburgh that traced all the way back to Highland Park in East Liberty when I was tortured, Masako Shiono. And Ruth Hammer. Ruth Hammer used to come to the Myron's house. She was a teacher who took sabbatical. And Midori Goto, of course, is working with one of the brains of the Highland Park East Liberty scene at the time, Michael Todd, at Sony, with the lyricist from King Crimson. Now, King Crimson came in. At the time, I didn't think they were Kent State shooters. But Dean Tierno did get shot by Tommy Cotieri, and then acknowledgement to DT shows up on one of their Starless Baba Black records. And it has this thing about in the door on the floor in a paper bag and a hyphen James. And I thought how ironic, because Kasparowski had kidnapped me and forced me to breathe inhalants in a paper bag, which Warhol, of course, called sniffing. Even though I was a picky eater and terrible trauma, hiding in my towel closet trying to get away from them, we moved. Rusted Root says no. Kid Crimson says no. But it says hyphen James in a paper bag. But then, and just Shushabu and just up slag, I started wondering, I started to make the connections. But I hadn't yet seen that Gail Burstyn was writing me the envelopes of yesterday for them. I hadn't yet seen that. But she said something about she raised him up and called him son and canonized the ground that he walked upon. I asked my mother, what does canonize mean? And she means like worship, she says. She explains to me, right? She's an English teacher. Well, my mother, I could never do anything right, but we now learn that Donald Trump, his mother said he never could do anything wrong. So they were setting up the invisible guest. They were creating an au pair through a mold of Aleister Crowley's crystal ball work. King Crimson was really thinking about me and working with Donald Trump when they put this together and tortured me and imprinted the first album with the screaming, on my psyche while force feeding me a nerve agent. So you have this au pair syndicate being developed already with a surrogate eugenic species to be inhumanly mistreated. So what comes out of this, of course, is that they replace the brain of Kennedy and installation Obama, who's like the mannequin in the window for the poor black man who has been cheated. But the real image that they're conveying came in Pete Cateno's film, Brother. In the end, after a slaughterhouse of a Yakuza gangster western of killing people, he gives a briefcase of money to the brother who's crying and saying, oh my God, look at all this money. That's the real Obama in this. So you have, this moron Obama who can't figure out that he's perpetuating Herbert Hoover's pro-Nazism through all of this. So convincing irony, it's not.